Good evening. I'm Linda Reynolds. I'm the director at the Stillwater Public Library, and I thank you for coming out this evening for our program. Before I continue, I would like to make an announcement regarding the location for our upcoming programs. The March 20th Osage Tribal Murders documentary film and the March 26th Osage Visual Arts programs will be here at the Community Center. The March 24th Osage Cultural Fair will remain at the Stillwater Public Library. It's a come-and-go event from 1 to 5 p.m. that day. That's a Saturday. The April 5th Osage Ballet is here. It was always scheduled here, and so it'll stay here at the Community Center. And we have secured Gallagher-Iba Arena for the David Grand visit on April 12th. So, therefore, that means we no longer need tickets. Thank you. So if you came to the kickoff event and we were talking to you about tickets and you were registering for book discussion and we were talking to you about tickets, don't worry about tickets anymore. Just show up at Gallagher-Iba Arena on April 12th. The doors will open at 6 and the event will start at 7. We're just so thrilled to have such response from our community regarding this. Now for tonight's program. This is the third program in our 9th community-wide reading event. One Book, One Community, Killers of the Flower Moon, the Osage Murders, and the Birth of the FBI. This series is designed to foster a sense of community through a shared reading experience and to increase an understanding of a dark period in Oklahoma history and an appreciation of the Osage Nation. The Stillwater Public Library received grants from Oklahoma Humanities and the Osage Nation Foundation to support this community-wide reading series. Other major sponsors include the National Endowment for the Humanities, OSU Library, Friends of the Stillwater Public Library, and the Stillwater Public Library Trust. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this series do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities or National Endowment for the Humanities. To ensure future funding, we request that you complete the evaluation you received when you arrived, and you may leave it in the box located in the lobby after the program. Osage area partners include the Osage Nation Historic Preservation Office, the Wajaji Cultural Center, Osage Nation Language Department, and the Pawhuska Public Library. And we are live streaming to Pawhuska this evening, courtesy of O-State TV. Stillwater community partners include Stillwater History Museum at the Sherrar, Stillwater Community Center, City of Stillwater, Stillwater Schools Indian Education Program, Bliss Books and Bindery, Modella Art Gallery, and Next Generation Advertising. OSU partners include the Museum of Art, Center for Oklahoma Studies, Native American Faculty and Staff Association, Division of Cultural Diversity, Center for Poets and Writers, Center for Sovereign Nations, Center for American Indian Studies, Native American Student Association, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, Stillwater Center for the Arts, Friends of the OSU Library, and the Atherton Hotel. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker. On July 1st, 2006, Dr. Dwight Adams became the first director of the University of Central Oklahoma Forensic Science Institute. The Institute leads continuing education in forensic science for professionals and UCO's undergraduate and graduate forensic science programs. Dr. Adams retired with 23 years from the FBI after serving as director of the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. In 2003, Dr. Adams was the recipient of the Presidential Rank Award as Distinguished Executive, the highest award given in the federal government. Dr. Adams was a member of the FBI's research team that developed the DNA techniques first used in 1988. He has testified as a DNA expert in federal, state, and local courts for the prosecution and defense in excess of 130 times. He also served on the National DNA Advisory Board responsible for creating standards governing all DNA testing crime laboratories in the U.S. and was a member of the Attorney General's National Commission on the Future of DNA Evidence. Dr. Adams oversaw the creation of the National DNA Database linking 195 crime laboratories and responsible for solving or aiding more than 300,000 cases nationwide. He is the author of numerous scientific publications, mostly in the field of DNA technology applied to human identification. He was a member of the Oklahoma Justice Commission, dedicated to enhancing the reliability and accuracy of forensic science and preventing wrongful convictions. Please help me welcome Dr. Dwight Adams.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you very much for that warm welcome. How's that? Is that better? Good. Let me start all over and thank you for that warm welcome, and Linda for that very nice introduction. Also, thank you, Linda and the Stillwater Public Library for the invitation to this very important book series regarding a portion of the history of Oklahoma. It's an honor to be a part of that. I'd like to begin today and just tell you a little bit about the Institute where I am. I would like to. This is the Forensic Science Institute at the University of Oklahoma, and I'm very biased when I say I think we have the finest forensic science education program in the country right here in Oklahoma at the University of Central Oklahoma. One reason, next slide, would be our facilities. Next slide. Our facilities are quite good, next slide, including an evidence bay that you can drive a car into and teach crime scene processing on that vehicle. Next slide. But I think even more important than the facilities would be the faculty. As Linda mentioned, I led the largest, most complex laboratory in the world with 750 men and women for the FBI. And I was very fortunate to be able to bring with me several of my colleagues, including the former head of the FBI's Explosives Unit, the former head of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the former chief counsel for the FBI, and many others. So not only do we have tremendous facilities, but an outstanding faculty. Next slide. As Linda mentioned, I was a part of the research team in the mid-1980s that developed the DNA technology that is in use today. As a part of that, I was then responsible for taking that technology and implementing it into casework in 1988. As the only agent qualified at the time, I was then responsible for testifying in trials. The very first trial using DNA in a court of law by the FBI was in Maui, Hawaii. It was a rough assignment to go to Maui. But I made it okay. There was a lot of media attention there in Maui regarding this first trial, and I thought, you know, after trial, after the next night, that I would get up and get a copy of the newspaper at the hotel lobby, and I did, and there was a picture on the front page, and next slide, and there I am. It wasn't quite the picture I had in mind. I had hoped to send that back to my mom, who lives here in Oklahoma, but not even my mother would recognize me in that picture. But that's all right. I had plenty of other trials down the road. 2 weeks later, I was in Nashville, Tennessee, testifying in the very first trial in the state of Tennessee using DNA technology. Same thing. The next morning, went to the hotel lobby, got a copy of the paper. There it was, front page, top of the fold. I hope you recognize that's not me in the picture. That is my name under the picture, but that's the defendant on trial. they got confused as to who was on trial and who the expert witness was. Next slide. Well, I know many of you have probably read the book by David Grann, and he did a masterful job in telling this important story about a very dark period in Oklahoma's history, and it's really an honor for me to be a small part of this book series. Next slide. I'm going to focus everything tonight on Molly Burkhardt and her 3 sisters. This evening we'll focus on the death of Rita, killed by an explosion, Anna, shot in the back of the head, and Minnie, who, as it says here on the slide, doctors referred to as dying from a peculiar wasting illness, but I think everyone would agree that she was likely poisoned. Next slide. So I'm going to start with Anna, and you'll notice the date there, 1929, when her decomposed body was found. And then you notice that I have several things listed with an asterisk. Those are the things that I'm going to compare what happened then versus what would happen today. For example, a coroner's inquest, a field autopsy, a gunshot wound, car tracks, a bottle found at the crime scene, and the identification. Identification of a decomposed body can be very difficult. Next slide. But keep in mind that the FBI laboratory didn't even exist in 1921. It wasn't until 1932 that the FBI laboratory came into existence. It's really even hard to say it's the FBI laboratory because it existed in one room, room 802 in the old Southern Railway station. This room was chosen because it had running water. It had one microscope. That microscope didn't even belong to the FBI. It was on loan from the manufacturer. It had one ultraviolet light, one light to look down the barrel of a firearm, and one agent. Special Agent Charles Appel was the only agent assigned to the FBI laboratory at this time, and he had already been working in the area of handwriting examinations for the FBI, but now he was to become the Abby Shuto of the famous NCIS series. He was to become the Abby Shuto of the FBI. It was a one-man operation. Next slide. I mentioned that there was a coroner's inquest and a field autopsy. Keep in mind that in the U.S., most deaths were investigated through a coroner's inquest, not by a medical examiner or a forensic pathologist. In fact, the very first medical examiner's office here in the U.S. Is the one pictured here in New York City. And it didn't begin until 1918. Along with it came a forensic toxicology lab. And so we really have just the very beginnings of the medical examiner facilities in the U.S., nothing here in Oklahoma. The field autopsy done in this book, it was done by local doctors without any training in forensic pathology. And as you read through this book, likely involved also in the great conspiracy here, especially when you have a victim shot in the head, yet no bullet is recovered. Next slide. Well, a lot has changed since 1918 there in New York City and even here in Oklahoma. Today, most states have medical examiner offices with trained forensic pathologists and forensic toxicology laboratories. Even in Oklahoma, we began our medical examiner's office in 1961. I say we began it. That's when the legislature authorized the medical examiner's office, but it wasn't until 1967 until they actually funded that office. So not much has changed in the decades. If you'll recall, about 5 or 6 years ago, the medical examiner's office here in Oklahoma lost its accreditation. The reason it lost its accreditation, it was still in the building that was built in 1967. They could not sustain accreditation, but they have just recently moved into a newly renovated building and are doing a tremendous job. Next slide. In the book, it talks about the identification of Anna, and that identification was simply by a gold tooth filling. And of course, that wouldn't stand up in a court of law today. And in fact, the identification system here in the U.S. and around the world was quite different than it is today. In use here in the U.S. and around the world was the Bertillon method. This method of body part measurements, about 20 to 22 different measurements, was the system in which we could identify one person from another using these measurements. Next slide. But it was in the early 1900s that the Bertillon method was thrown out, and it was based upon these two individuals named William West and Will West that were both incarcerated at Leavenworth Penitentiary. William West was already in the penitentiary. Will West was being brought in, and a guard noticed him and said, "How did you escape?" Well, long story short, William West and Will West are two different people. When they brought Will West in, they performed the Bertillon measurements on him, and they discovered that they were exactly like William West. And from that point on, Bertillon method was thrown out, and fingerprints became the method of choice for identification because Will and William West had different fingerprints. Next slide. There was a bottle of moonshine found at the crime scene, and obviously fingerprints would likely be on that bottle, but fingerprints were not in common use at all in Oklahoma or elsewhere here in the United States. It wasn't until the late 1800s that Francis Galton discovered the use of fingerprints for identification purposes. But still, in 1921, fingerprints were not taken upon arrest of an individual. Fingerprints were not collected at crime scenes, and there was no central filing system as there is today. But it was Galton that is credited with being the father, if you will, of fingerprints, realizing that they are permanent and that they do provide a means for positive identification. Next slide. Latent print automation began in 1999 in the FBI, connecting law enforcement all over the country. Fingerprints were in use then from 1930s all the way to 99, but it wasn't until automation came along that allowed one department to share fingerprints with another and to check their own records. Today, over 70 million individuals have their fingerprints on file. Next slide. And in fact, improvements have been made as recently as 2014 using the next generation identification system. This system is much more robust than the integrated automated fingerprint identification system of '99, and it allows for the inclusion of not only fingerprints, but also palm prints. On the entire surface of your palm, you have friction-ridged skin, and any of that area can be used for identification purposes. Next slide. The bottle of moonshine found at the crime scene in today would obviously be looked at for fingerprints as well as DNA. But back in the early 1900s, we were just discovering the ABO blood type systems, and methods were being developed by Leon Latz to actually be able to test a sample for the blood types. And this could be done in the 1950s and 60s in the FBI laboratory, and could be done even with saliva. Saliva on the rim of the bottle could be tested, and if the individual was a secretor, then we could tell the blood type of that individual using the ABO blood typing system. Next slide. But today, it's DNA. That ABO blood typing system is just an inclusion or exclusion type of method. But DNA is an identification method. When we began doing DNA in the FBI laboratory in 1988, it would take us 6 weeks from beginning to end for one case. But that allowed us to positively identify the contributor of a blood stain or a saliva stain or a semen stain. Today, though, it doesn't take 6 weeks. It's about 24 hours. 24 hours to get even far better results than we could ever do back in 1988. And this DNA technology is absolutely the single greatest advance in forensic science since the discovery of fingerprints approximately 100 years ago. Next slide. Not only do we have the capabilities within one case to make identification, but using CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System created by the FBI, we now connect over 190 laboratories throughout the United States, all doing DNA testing in criminal investigations. And by connecting them, we're sharing information. And this act, enacted by Congress in 1994, allowed the FBI to create CODIS, to begin to analyze samples and place them into CODIS, and to have this national DNA data bank. Next slide. CODIS contains files of convicted offender DNA profiles, convicted offenders, forensic samples, unsolved cases, as well as missing persons. You'll notice there by the offender, it also says arrestees. All 50 states here in the United States now have laws on their books that require certain convicted felons to give a DNA sample to be included into CODIS. 30 states now have enacted legislation requiring arrestees to give a sample, and Oklahoma is one of those 30 states. Next slide. So CODIS is a very simple process where a local laboratory like Tallahassee, Florida, can perform DNA testing on evidence from a crime and compare that at the state level to all convicted offenders in Florida and all unsolved cases. If there are no hits, then it's sent to the national system by the FBI. And there it is compared against all 50 states. Well, how successful has CODIS been? Next slide. Today, there are over 13 million DNA profiles from convicted offenders, almost 3 million arrestees, but those numbers are going to grow quite rapidly. And there have been over 400,000 cases solved because CODIS exists, sharing information, connecting cases to convicted offenders. Next slide. DNA is not just for identifying the perpetrator. DNA is robust, it is powerful, and it can exonerate those that have been wrongly convicted. This is a picture of Kirk Blodsworth. Kirk Blodsworth spent 9 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He was convicted before the use of DNA, and DNA was done on the evidence after conviction, after it came into existence, and he was exonerated by the power of DNA. Next slide. This is another individual, Earl Fuller, from Mansfield, Ohio. Earl Fuller likely would have seen prison as well, based upon the fact that he was being charged with the rape of 2 elderly women. Both women picked him out of a lineup, and it's no doubt that with that kind of powerful evidence, he would have ultimately been convicted. The police sent in his known blood sample and the evidence from the case to the FBI laboratory. We performed the test. We showed that the same perpetrator was responsible for these 2 crimes, but it wasn't Earl Fuller. The Mansfield, Ohio police thought there had to be a mistake. They thought they had the right individual, so they took another blood sample from Earl Fuller, sent that to us, thinking they had maybe mixed up samples. We performed the test again and found the same results. Earl Fuller wasn't responsible, and ultimately Mansfield PD found the correct individual. Earl Fuller was spared prison because of the power of DNA. Next slide. I talked about the gunshot to the head of Anna there in 1921. It was just 8 years later that Calvin Goddard developed the comparison microscopy technique for bullet and cartridge case comparisons. Calvin Goddard developed this technique, and now it's the same technology that is being used today in modern crime laboratories. Forensic science, though, as you can see at this time, is still very much in its infancy. Next slide. This was an important tool in comparison to evidence that you collect from the crime scene and the evidence that you use from test fires into that water tank on the right. And it's the side-by-side comparison using microscopy that allows us to rule in or rule out a particular firearm. Next slide. Such as looking at the firing pin impression on a cartridge case found at the crime scene. Next slide. And in this slide, you can see the arrow at the top. That arrow is a line of demarcation showing the overlap of the evidence on the left and the test fire on the right, and looking for similarities in those 2 cartridge cases. Next slide. And the same with projectiles or bullets. The lands and grooves within a barrel will impart those lands and grooves onto the bullet, and the microscopic marks called stria within those lands and grooves can be looked at under the comparison microscope. And it allows us, again, to compare side by side the evidence on the left to the test fire on the right, looking at the stria across the land impression. Next slide. And just like DNA, just like CODIS was used to connect laboratories, so is the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network, NIBIN. NIBIN connects crime laboratories from across the United States with firearms and ballistics evidence. And this was developed in 1990. Next slide. And hit it one more time. This is a representation of the sniper case back in 2002 in the Washington, D.C. area, where over a period of about a month, multiple people were killed by this sniper all throughout the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. 15 different law enforcement agencies were working these different cases. They all had their own crime laboratories. But because of NIBIN connecting those laboratories, the ballistics evidence from those cases were connected based upon this network. Next slide. Most law enforcement agencies here in the U.S. Have crime scene investigators, crime scene units, CSIs, and they have duties and responsibilities, much like what you see here are the 6 basic crime scene positions that most agencies will employ. Next slide. And the FBI and many others teach this 12-step process in crime scene collection and preservation. You'll notice there I've highlighted number 3, secure and protect the scene. I read in the book where many onlookers were there at the scene where Anna's body was discovered. And that's one of the first things that you have to do in crime scene investigations, is to secure and protect that evidence. Next slide. I have this digital evidence in quotation marks because it really wasn't digital back in 1921, but Molly hired a private investigator to assist this investigation because they were getting nowhere at the local or state level. And so this private investigator began to go through the handwritten records of the operator, because all calls were placed through the switchboard. Next slide. But digital evidence today is much different. Probably almost everyone in here has a cell phone, has something digital in nature, and it is the most common form of evidence that we find in crimes across America today. And digital evidence is the fastest growing area within forensic science, and it changes almost daily with new phones and new technology coming out at rapid speed. Next slide. In the book, it also talked about car tracks at the crime scene. Many things can be determined from car tracks. Obviously, at that time, there were no capabilities. There were no impressions made of those car tracks. But today, impressions would be made, and you would be able to determine the possible make and model of the car through a number of features that can come from a car, like the tire treads. You'll notice in the very far right corner, the little car, it has a chip of paint on the front end of that car. That little chip of paint is enough to determine the make and model of car, because we understand the number of layers of paint, the chemical content of the paint, the colors of the paint. All those can be determined, placed into a national database, and you can determine the make and model of the car. How big is that little chip of paint? Well, the car you see on the right bottom corner is the same car on the back of the $10 bill up at the top right corner. It's a very small chip of paint. Even fibers from a car. A body that has been placed in a car, driven to another area and dumped, is likely going to have carpet fibers from the car or the trunk. Those fibers can be analyzed by color, chemical composition, and structure, placed into a database, and you can determine the make and model of the car from that information. Next slide. Shoe prints would have also likely been at that crime scene, but there were no capabilities back in 1921. Instead, today, we have a shoe print database, one in which it will tell us the manufacturer and model of shoe that is recovered at the crime scene. Well, this is a picture of Molly's mother in the middle, Lizzie. Lizzie and Minnie were both potentially poisoned because they used the same terminology of wasted away. And the understanding of poisons and the capability of testing for those poisons in the human body were just not present. Although Matthew Orfila, the father of forensic toxicology and the author of the very first book on poisons, published his book in the early 1800s, still testing was unavailable in these early days of 1900s. Next slide. Recall that it was the New York City Chief Medical Examiner's Office in 1918 that had the very first forensic toxicology unit. Next slide. But today, in the FBI laboratory, in their $6 million room, we have the capabilities to do this kind of testing. It's called the $6 million room because the equipment in this room is $6 million. Next slide. To include gas chromatography, time of flight mass spectrometry, Fourier transform infrared spectrophotometry, and many other capabilities to test body fluids or tissues looking for something that doesn't belong there, like a poison. Next slide. Looking at tissues or fluids and comparing that to a library. The results on the upper portion would be the evidence. Those results from GC mass spec then are compared to a library within that instrument. And the library is showing here that that is the same makeup for the drug methamphetamine. Next slide. A modern day case involving poisons, for example, would be this one. In the FBI, we called it codename CMURS. It stood for Seattle Murders. It seemed that Stella Nickel wanted to not have her husband around any longer. So instead of divorcing him, she decided to replace his Excedrin capsules with cyanide. And he died, but her husband was quite a bit older than she was. And cyanide can have an effect that appears to be a heart condition. Next slide. And so a heart attack can often be confused. And if there's no autopsy performed, then the pathologist that's not even there, there's not going to be any discovery of poisons. Cyanide poisoning upon autopsy will reveal a very unique odor that smells like burnt almonds. But because of his advanced age and heart condition, there was no autopsy performed. He was buried. She received his insurance policy money, and she thought all was fine. Next slide. She thought all was fine until she discovered that had he died of unnatural causes, she would have gotten twice the amount of money that she got originally. So she goes and she begins to replace the Excedrin capsules with more cyanide poison. She places those bottles in the store. An unsuspecting victim number 2 comes and purchases that, takes it, dies from it. And she was not as old, and therefore an autopsy was performed. Cyanide poisoning was discovered. We now have the very first case involving product tampering. And Stella Nichols decided to call the police and said, I think my husband might have died of the same thing. Well, in our business, that's called a clue. And so the investigation goes on. Next slide. She becomes a suspect, and lo and behold, we go to the public library there in Seattle, and we discover that she checked out a book on poisons, and her fingerprint is on chapter 6, which is cyanide poisonings. She has a receipt for algae destroyer, a common algicide that contains cyanide. And in her home was a mortar and pestle still with residue from the cyanide poisoning. Next slide. Rita Smith died 2 years later. She died from an explosion there at her home. There was no post-blast IED or improvised explosive device examination capabilities at this time. By this time, over 24 tribe members had already been killed, and she is killed 2 years after her sister. In contrast to today, next slide, we have the capabilities of looking at devices, improvised explosive devices, either pre-blast or post-blast. This is an example of one such case when in 2001, at the same time that 9/11 is going on, at the same time that the anthrax case is going on, we have Richard Reed boarding American Airlines Flight 63 in Italy, heading to Miami. While over the Atlantic Ocean, he takes his shoes off. Next slide. He takes his shoes off and places them against the edge of the aircraft. Next slide. And it's his hope to light this black powder timing fuse right here, that it would burn down to this detonator. This detonator is filled with the peroxide-based explosive TATP. It would set off the det cord, which is PETN, and all of the white matrix there is an explosive as well. He tried with 6 different kitchen matches to set that black powder timing fuse off, but it didn't work, and we believe it didn't work because his feet sweat got it wet. The crew was able to subdue him. They landed safely in Boston, and he was charged, convicted, and is now serving a life sentence in Florence, Colorado. But we needed to know what would have happened had he been successful there in this effort. Next slide. So we did a complete analysis of his improvised explosive device and looked at it from head to toe, if you will. And the detonator was simply a rolled piece of notebook paper, and inside that notebook paper was a human head hair, but it wasn't from Richard Reed. And the palm print on that notebook paper was also not Richard Reed. So it's obvious that someone else constructed that device, and he was the mule carrying that device. Next slide. So we needed to know what would have happened. We constructed the very same device using the very same kind of shoes. We purchased an airplane out in the middle of the desert. We set that shoe against the edge of the aircraft. Next slide. And we set it off, and it blows a hole 2 feet by 2 feet in the side of the aircraft. Well, that's a good study. It tells us a lot, but it doesn't tell us what a pressurized cabin, how a pressurized cabin would react to an IED like this. So the next step in the process is to buy another plane. Next slide. We take that plane, go ahead and run that. We take that plane out to the desert, we set it off. Next slide. Obviously, it would have been catastrophic, and now you know why you take your shoes off when you go through airport security. It was the research on this case that prompted the federal government to make those kinds of changes. Now we exploit IEDs, and we do that not just in criminal investigations, but we do that in wars. Here in Iraq and Afghanistan, IEDs have killed and maimed countless numbers of our servicemen and women. And so in the FBI, we created what was called, and still is today, the Terrorist Explosive Device Analytical Center. Its sole purpose is to exploit these IEDs for information in order to connect them together with terrorist and wars all over the world. Next slide. One example of that exploitation involved this long-range cordless phone. A fingerprint was discovered inside the phone, and it was compared against a database and was determined to be an individual already incarcerated in Iraq, and so we had identified the bomb maker through this exploitation. Next slide. Well, here we are then in 1925, 4 years of really limited investigation as well as widespread corruption by state and local officials. Just nothing was getting done. But J. Edgar Hoover became the director of the FBI, and he became director and was director for a year by 1925. He came to the FBI as a young man from the Library of Congress, and he brought with him, I think, 2 very important things. One was professionalism. He brought professionalism to the FBI, and he brought an index system. Now, in today's society, all you need to do is Google, and you can find out what it is you want to do. But in 1925, even when I was a first office agent in Memphis, Tennessee, we used the index system brought to us by J. Edgar Hoover, And that index system allowed us to know who we've interviewed, what they said, and be able to compare that information with any field office there in the country. This was a major step in professionalizing the FBI, as well as bringing tools to bear in criminal investigations. The FBI was still called the Bureau of Investigation in 1925. They had no arrest powers. They didn't officially carry weapons. Fingerprints were still in their infancy. Hoover creates the identification system that would one day house the fingerprints, but still in its infancy. And now they begin to handle or investigate crimes, a dozen or more crimes, including crimes on Indian reservations. So it was under Director Hoover that he tagged Special Agent in Charge Tom White, a former Texas Ranger, to come from Texas to Oklahoma to lead the Oklahoma City field office of the FBI and to lead in this investigation. Next slide. And it was his efforts, Special Agent in Charge White and his team's effort, that uncovered William Hale's master plan to acquire the head rights through corruption, bribery, co-conspirators that included businessmen, funeral directors, law enforcement officers, lawyers, bankers, mayors, prosecutors, judges, among others. And finally, William Hale and his co-defendant, John Ramsey, were convicted in the death of Henry Roan. One death. And it was through handwriting analysis that really hasn't changed much over those many years that led to that conviction. Next slide. Hoover would use this success by Special Agent in Charge White and in promotional news articles, in movie reels, including the Lucky Strike Hour. In fact, one major article was quoted as saying how the government with the most gigantic fingerprint system on earth fights crime with an unheard of scientific refinements, and on and on. Well, I think that can be summed up in the advertisement on the right. That advertisement is saying you should smoke Lucky Strike cigarettes because it'll prevent you from eating candy and getting fat. As you well know, the gigantic fingerprint system did not exist. Unheard of science refinements did not exist in 1925. Next slide. The Osage murders were not solved by forensic science, but by good, honest, hardworking investigators. There was a quote on the very last page of this book, and that quote is on the screen. It says, "There are men amongst the whites, honest men, but they are mighty scarce." You know, FBI Special Agent in Charge Tom White, I believe, was one of these scarce men. Next slide. In conclusion, the author of this book, this past April, made a statement in a public forum, and he said there was a deeper, darker conspiracy that the Bureau never exposed. And you know, after reading this book, that's exactly what I was left with. I was left with exactly what David Gran described here. Only 2 convictions, but unresolved conspiracy that went far beyond the mastermind of William Hale. And it's unfortunate. This was a very dark time in Oklahoma's history, but I am appreciative of David Gran and his efforts in researching this to bring this story to bear. Having grown up here in Oklahoma, being a part of public school system, I was required to take Oklahoma history, but I don't recall this story ever being told in that history. Well, I very much appreciate you coming tonight, listening to this, and it's been a pleasure to be with you.
course. Oh, good. My husband is from Fairfax and Osage County, where some of these killings took place. And I'm wondering if you know if the family lore that's been passed down in our family is true. They lived in a little house outside of town, and the story is that an FBI agent, undercover as a straggled-looking man coming down the road looking for food and work, came to their ranch and lived in their hayloft barn while he was undercover as an FBI agent investigating the crimes. Is that consistent with what would have happened back then?
Well, I can tell you, based upon the pay they used to have back in 1921, they probably were dressed like that on purpose. That's all they could afford. And no, I cannot answer that. I don't know. It is clear in the book that other agents were brought in as a part of Special Agent White's team, and some did serve in an undercover capacity to gain information. So it's very likely that could be true.
And how many forensic schools do we have in the United States?
That's a good question, and thank you for asking it. I mentioned at the beginning that I think we have the finest forensic science education program in the country right here at UCO, and one of the reasons I can make that statement is we are the only undergraduate education program in the country, in North America, that is accredited in all forensic science disciplines that can be accredited. No other program has that level of accreditation. There are literally dozens of programs throughout the country, but only 24 of them are accredited at any level, and ours at the highest level.
Fingerprints change as you age?
A good question about fingerprints. Do they change as you age? And the answer is, for the most part, no. The fingerprints you are born with are the fingerprints you die with. However, scars can impact the print, but the overall print itself does not change over time. They're permanent.
And other places, and they cannot usually get my fingerprints. Very difficult.
Well, we also have, and I'm not suggesting that you are in any way like this, but we also have difficulty getting prints off of decomposing bodies. And we utilize very special techniques. One is called the Osmotic Rehydration method. And I might recommend this to you the next time you have, and this is serious now, this is not funny. Osmotic Rehydration method, that's a very fancy sounding name for simply placing your hands in very warm water for a few seconds and then having your fingerprints taken. What that does is rehydrate that friction-ridged skin to make them easier to obtain. I hope that helps you.
Would a coroner at the time of the Osage murders have been a medical professional? And today, what's the difference in qualifications between a coroner and a medical examiner?
Yeah, there are a few jurisdictions in the United States that still use coroners, but oftentimes coroners may be funeral home directors or just some other citizen without medical training. Today, the medical examiners are forensic pathologists. They are medical doctors that have been trained as a doctor and then gone on to residency, multiple years of residency, training specifically for cause and manner of death determination.
When you mentioned the tires and shoe prints that can be used as evidence, I wondered, is there just a massive team of researchers and catalogers and archivists that collect every possible tire and every possible shoe print?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it does take a lot of effort to keep up with the paint on automobiles, to keep up with new tires as they're produced, to keep up with new shoes as they're produced. And so yes, there is a massive effort to maintain those kinds of databases for criminal investigations.
So you've mentioned digital forensics and how it's a growing area. What's coming next? What would you like to see more forensic work being done in?
Well, I think one of the areas that was born as a result of the events of 2001 during 9/11, but it wasn't related specifically to 9/11, it was the anthrax investigation. The anthrax investigation, those letters that were sent to senators, to news organizations and elsewhere, laced with the deadly anthrax spores. Microbial forensics was born out of that investigation, and that took us 7 years to solve. And it required new technologies, new techniques, and new understandings of microorganisms. And when you see on the news the likelihood that something like this could be used, when you have nerve gas being used in the UK against a former Russian double agent, these kind of devices or chemicals or organisms are very concerning, and it's necessary that we are out in front of them and not trying to catch up as those events happen. This is an area, microbial forensics, that needs to be in the forefront.
This will be our last question.
That was fascinating. Is this on? Okay, that was fascinating. But I was also curious when it comes to DNA capture. On your saliva slide, you mentioned something about secretors, which implies, of course, that there are people who don't secrete. So what are some of the challenges with collecting that kind of information at a crime scene?
Yeah, good question. The secretor issue only dealt with the ABO blood typing system, which isn't in use anymore. Today, if someone drank from a bottle, we would be able to swab the mouth end of that bottle and obtain a DNA sample from it. In fact, technology is so robust today that simply by handling an item, we have the capabilities of obtaining your DNA from simply handling that item. That was unheard of in 1988. We needed a stain about the size of a dime to get enough DNA from. But technology today has pushed us into the future, and we can get it on samples that you can't even see. Again, thank you very much.